Welcome back, or welcome to the Time-Crunched Cyclist podcast. I'm your host, Coach Adam Pulford. Once again, we've got Jim Rutberg, aka Ruddy, on the show. Welcome back, Jim.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, so we're going to get right into it today, and I'm going to ask you the question straight up, and just give it to me here, Ruddy. Can you get faster by training only 6 hours per week?
Yes, you can. You just have to be a little bit more careful about how you do it and be okay with some of the caveats that come along with it. You can be faster, but you're not going to be faster for every single kind of event out there.
Took the words out of my mouth, so I'll just answer and say yes. Yes, you can. All right, so let's talk about how we do this, because everybody, their ears are perking up, and they probably took the clickbait, which is why they're here, on how to get faster in 6 hours. Because a lot of people think they need 20 hours a week, right? So
if you have 20 hours a week, great. And we all, the volume has always worked. That's there's a reason that pro athletes ride 20 to 30 hours a week and things like that. And as you and I have talked about off air, there's a giant hype around Zone 2 this year, and it's these things come and go in cycles, and now we're back to Zone 2, and everybody's go easy, go easy, go easy, and then it comes back to the Time-Crunched Cyclist, which honestly, the Time-Crunched Cyclist book initially was a response to the same environment. That was the environment we were seeing in 2008.
Yeah, I was going to say, how
we started writing the book.
Yeah.
And we're back, it's come around again. And the point that I had then and the point that I have now is that, yes, volume works. Zone 2 is great, but there's nothing wrong with the other components or the other areas within the spectrum of intensity to achieve the same endpoint. If you have to be able to use all of the aspects of physiology that you have access to, and that includes high intensity systems and low intensity systems, and adjusting them based on your goals and the time availability that you have. Telling somebody who only has 6 hours a week that, I'm sorry, you can only ride in Zone 2 because that's the be all end all of physiology right now, they're not going to get anywhere. You're going to be able to ride Zone 2 for however long you're going to be able to ride it, but you're not going to get fast on a low volume of low intensity. There's at some point you're going to have to go hard.
So would you say that time-rich athletes would be Zone 2 shaming the time-crunched athlete?
I think what's happening, honestly, is that the sports science, and we've seen this over and over again, there are coaches and sports scientists who are extraordinarily knowledgeable, and they are far smarter than I'm ever going to be, but they're focusing in on the sports science of it and the cellular physiology of it to the point that they're missing kind of the big picture of these are human beings out there with very different goals, with very different constraints, with even the psychological component of why they're training, their athlete identity, all of those things. And if you only look at the cellular physiology and cardiorespiratory physiology, and that's where you're going to base all of your training recommendations on, I think that's where there's a disconnect, because what looks great on paper doesn't necessarily match what an athlete needs in order to stay engaged with the sport, in order to have fun in the sport, in order to be a happy athlete, which is then a fast athlete. So I think that's where this idea of Zone 2 getting maybe overhyped for a while, and it'll rebalance itself the way it always does. But I think that's what we're starting to see in the sports science literature and Twitter feeds and things like that these days.
Yeah, fully agree. And I do think that when there is an overemphasis on one thing, the other aspects just get overlooked, right? And so right now with Zone 2, like, I see a lot of people overlooking just pure energy system development, which, from like when I first started learning about how to coach people, is just like, there's 3 energy systems. You have to train those 3 in order to make improvements. Short, let's just call it short, medium, longer term, right? Mm-hmm. And the intensity distribution that follows suit with all of those. And for people to overlook that, or to think that all they need to do is ride for X number of hours at zone 2, and then all of a sudden magically they have the power, whatever power it wants. Like, it's magic, right? That's like the concept right now, which is like crazy to me. And you overlook the performance development, because like if all you do is go zone 2 around, and then you jump in your first criterion, right? What
You're going to have a
happens?
rude awakening. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And then the specificity of training. So if all you do is zone 2 and you jump in any gravel race, what happens? Kind of a same thing, right?
Yeah, except for obviously with the gravel, you're going to do great 6 hours in. It's just that first hour you're going to get blown out the back because it's of the nature of how those races work. And then even the newest thing is the esports racing as well. I mean, those are
that's a good point.
The first 5 minutes of a Zwift race is ridiculously hard. So if you want to jump into those as well, it's going to be difficult when you've been going easy. There are multiple pathways to the same end result in physiology, and I think that that's the thing that gets lost in the conversation around zone 2 is that, and for Time-Crunched Cyclists, is that there's an aversion to high intensity because people think that it's going to harm them, and if it's done correctly and structured correctly, it's one of the only ways that you're going to get enough training stimulus to actually move yourself forward. If you don't have, what the classic equation is, time and intensity equals workload. And if you don't have much time and you still want workload, the only thing you can do is start increasing intensity.
Yeah, that's right. And so we just did a podcast. The episode before this is all about training density. And there we talk about how training density is condensing workload into a smaller block of time. And that could be just one session. It could be a couple sessions or like a couple days, right? It's really pertaining to condensing in with rhythm or pattern. And so that time crunched, I don't know, the more I was thinking about it, like a time crunched cyclist sort of pattern is the majority of the time, it's almost like a polarized pattern of sorts.
Well, see, that's the funny thing.
Yeah.
So this is, again, the cyclical nature of the thing and the fact that we've been doing this for as long as we have.
Yeah.
The concept or the terminology of polarized training and 80-20 came around about 10 years, 8 to 10 years after the initial Time-Crunched Cyclist book.
Yeah.
And then when it came out, and it's a very good way of explaining training. I mean, I like the idea of of polarized training and 80-20. It's something that athletes can understand, et cetera. But when you go back and look at what we were actually describing and how the training plans are structured within the Time-Crunched Cyclist book and everything else, it pretty much comes out at 80-20. Because yes, the focus of the book and the focus of how we presented the information was that you need high intensity intervals in order to achieve the workload necessary and the training stress necessary to make progress on 6 hours a week. But when you plan it all out, you realize that the time in zone, or the time at intensity within those workouts, you're still doing a lot of zone 2, because it's all of the riding to the intervals and the recovery between them, and then the endurance days that are spread out throughout the week. So there's nothing new under the sun kind of a thing. We've all been doing very similar kinds of structures for the last 15 years. We're just calling them slightly different things. And when you call them different things, they resonate with different athlete populations a little bit differently, and that's all well and good. The end result is we want everybody to get faster and stronger and have more fun on the bike. And if it means that you identify with Time-Crunched Cyclist as the way that resonates with you, wonderful. If it's 80-20 that resonates with you, wonderful. If it's zone 2 that resonates with you and you don't have a lot of time, I think you might struggle a little bit. But there's never there's never a perfect way for anyone to do these things, and I think that people need to be open to different structures and using as many aspects of their physiology as possible in order to achieve their goals.
Yeah, agreed. And I'll put a little qualifier in there in people who know these different training modalities of polarized or this time crunched aspect. They'll argue because they'll say, I mean, all the other like specifics that go into being a polarized model.
Mm-hmm.
Don't get bogged down in that, folks. For listeners, I'm just saying that from a rhythm or a pattern standpoint, meaning your hard days are hard, your easy days are easy. Dr. Seiler's approach is more volume based, but the distribution of intensities like more like a 90-10. The 80-20 it refers to the sessions. But when you look and try time crunched cycling approaches, like you'll find that the contrast between the sessions are really what we're talking about. And that's why I think polarized and time crunched and just a well-written training program works if you do keep the contrast between the days.
Right.
So please just kind of know that from that standpoint.
Okay, so then I have to push back on you a little bit, or get your input on the idea that zone 3 is useless or trash, or it's, you should never be in zone 3. You should only be in 1 or 2, or only be in, and especially going back to this athlete who has 6 to 8 hours a week kind of to train. Is there a good way for that athlete to utilize a tempo kind of zone 3 intensity, or should they really abandon that middle ground?
Burn the bridges, shame them at all costs. No, so Monday I just did a training ride, 2.5 hours of training, and it was burly. I did 2 hours at zone 3, like a high zone 3. And it was specific, and I'll probably make a post about it because there's some stuff that I was playing with there. So 2 hours of zone 3, and people were like, you can't do that, whatever. My point is the reason why you would use zone 3, well, there's many reasons, but one huge aspect is swing back to the previous podcast that we just did, where we talked about some of these mechanical and biomechanical breakdowns. When you're doing races and events, usually you're on the pedals and doing a lot more work in these zones, all these zones, right, over time, and people get cramps. People get fatigued more quickly, especially like late in the game on the last hill climb and all this kind of stuff, because they're typically doing more kilojoule per hour, more kilojoule in the session, or higher average powers than they've never done before, peak powers, right? Their muscles start to break down because mechanically they've never been there before, or they haven't been there in a while. Okay, meaning that.
So you're saying that zone 3 builds durability.
Bingo. Took the words right out of my mouth. Yep. It builds durability in a like quicker way, and in my opinion, like a more specific and better way, rather than just doing a 6 hours zone 2 ride. Like if I got 6 hours, I'm going to use all the zones, in my opinion. Because if you're in that, especially like if you're going to do races and stuff, you're going to do all the zones. So make it specific, right? Do all the zones in your training. And so, I use zone 3 a lot, especially in like even some base, right? If I'm time crunch, but if I've got a time rich athlete, I'll use zone 3 a lot in the prep just to get like this mechanical work done. And I'll build up to 90 minutes continuous in a training session to build that mechanical durability for athletes.
So you're still doing long tempo intervals, because I've seen some discussion recently about, okay, if you're going to use zone 3, really keep them almost to the same durations as kind of longer or extensive FTP workouts, where it's kind of no more than 20 minutes at a time at a tempo or sweet spot kind of intensity. So I guess the question for you would be, for the time crunched athlete, the person who's on a low volume training plan, would they be often better off using a shorter, let's say 20-minute or so zone 3 tempo interval structure, or try to get that person to go out and do a tempo workout that's the full hour, in order to get more kilojoules per hour and greater tension on the muscles for the full hour?
Yeah. So I mean, 1 by 90 minute at zone 3 tempo. That's pretty extreme. Like I just like swung for the fence, and that is like a very, you only use that a few times, and you have to build up to that. So
Yeah,
my bread and
not that
butters,
many people can do that.
yeah, no, exactly. And then like even like to this point, and I like text message with Coop and Jane and all these, like we have zone 2 shaming text group chain because it's hilarious. But I sent that to them, and Coop's like, they're gonna hang you at the gallows for all that zone 3 work, right? And so my point is not to swing for the fence and do that. I've only done that once in my life, and I've been riding for over 20 years, right? So that's a very aggressive way to do it. The bread and butters, especially if I have a time crunched athlete, 6 hours a week, you know, 3x10 at tempo, right? With 4-minute recovery in between is a very appropriate workout. 4x10, as we start to like, that's a lot of time in zone for a time crunched athlete. And you can extend that out like that, or you can also shorten the recovery period in between. So instead of 4 or 5 minutes for a 3x10 workout, shorten it down to 3 minutes, shorten it down to 2 minutes. And that's how I get people to get prepared or have the durability for more time in zone, right?
Now, are you using the recovery periods between those zone 3 intervals, the 4 minutes between 10-minute efforts? Is that more important from the physiology standpoint for recovery between intervals, or is it a focus kind of thing where it's too difficult for a lot of athletes to try to pace an effort for 20 minutes? But if we break it into 2 10-minute intervals, the execution is better, and the 4 minutes isn't all that necessary from a physiology standpoint, but we're breaking it up in order to improve the execution.
Yeah, mostly here,
Mostly
especially
the execution.
Yeah, mostly in the for the YouTube people, you saw that I pointed to my head mostly for there. However, it's both, right? Especially early on, like I talked about some of the mechanical aspect. Pedaling 40 minutes straight at tempo, the legs probably couldn't handle that if you've never done it before, and if you're like a newer sort of athlete. And so 4x10 with 3 in between, that's going to get enough time in zone without a lot of recovery to still overload the system. However, I find a lot of benefit both, mentally and physically to do a straight 1x40. And you want to build up to that. Because again, we talked about in the previous podcast, I talked about a podcast with Dr. Seiler, where we talked about the exponential strain throughout a session,
Right.
whether it is long or the exponential strain of like a zone 3 and 4 that occurs with just severe glycogen depletion, muscle recruitment, time and under tension for the work that you're doing, sub threshold or threshold.
Right. So for people who are less familiar with that, you're essentially saying that the first 10 minutes of a 40-minute tempo interval is not the same as the last 10 minutes of a 40-minute tempo interval, even if your power output is identical.
Exactly. And specifically, the fatigue rate is not the same. So let's just call it the first 10 minutes of a 40-minute tempo gets you, 10 TSS points. That same 10 TSS points is not the same as the last 10 TSS points.
Even though that's not accounted for in TSS. Like if somebody's looking at it, they will still get 10 points for each end of that interval. But we're saying that what's truly happening is that the value of those 10 points at the end are different than the value of the 10 points at the beginning, which I think is important for people to realize in terms of why workouts are structured the way they are, especially for time crunch people where the intervals are important, and zone 3 or even threshold intervals are important, and it's important to do them to build up to the point where you're doing them long enough so that those longer intervals really do have a different impact than shorter intervals.
Exactly. Yeah. It's super fun to like talk to Ruddy about this. We're getting into the weeds a little bit here with some of the stuff, but it actually does matter because when it all comes down to how you actually execute this, you got to understand that like people like Ruddy and I have these like way down the line sort of conversations in order to like bring it up and then write articles, do podcasts, and like tell you how to do this. And I think it's also important as a listener, you're listening to this because you're like super into it. So I hope you're like also enjoying us like nerd out a little bit on this aspect. But yeah, I think when it comes down to that applicability, folks, like it doesn't matter if you start with 8 minute or 10 minute intervals. I would encourage you to lengthen or go like extensive development with zone 3 and zone 4 to get to some of these parameters, right? And the parameters, the most extensive that I look for, like in a 1 by sort of situation, is like up to 90 minutes for tempo, up to 60 minutes for threshold at zone 4. And those are some pretty good hinge points that are also very, very aggressive.
And we're going to put some actual, you put in some specific workouts that we'll put into the notes for
Yeah.
people on how to structure. It's like a Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday kind of organization of training for what an intensive or extensive, I think it was FTP kind of structure would look like. So anywhere that the notes are available for the podcast, you'll be able to find those workouts.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll get into those. And I do encourage everyone to like go to that landing page, or to like, if people have iPhones, like go there and just like look, and those example workouts will be there. And it's a very like simple, great examples of how to like where to start from that. So we'll put it in there. But I guess like before we get into the specific workouts, Ruddy, what do we do with some of this conversation about, okay, we're limited on time, so we're going to use intensity to start to tease out performance. And I have all these zones. So when it comes to like zone distribution, where do I choose to start spending my time? Something like that.
Right. So I think what people are running into right now, especially if they're looking at their own training, is that whether you're using Training Peaks or Strava or however you're looking at it, you'll find a graph that has this zone distribution. And when people look at it, and if you're currently, if you've been riding mostly endurance and in foundation period, and you're moving toward getting more specific and into racing or into events, look at the zone distribution that you've been doing recently. And if you find that there's a lot, you're spending as much time in zone 3 as zone 2, which is, I think, what happens to a lot of people because they gravitate to just a little bit harder than zone 2 because it's more fun to go a little faster. That's when the next step is to try to separate those two, so that you're either going to spend more time in zone 3 and really focus on it, or you're going to spend more time in zone 2 and really focus on it. So I think the difficult part for people right now is that if you're finding that zone 2 and zone 3 are very equal right now, it's just a matter of shifting focus to one or the other, so, for a period of time, so that you get some more specificity. And at this time of year, it's probably going to be shifting more into zone 3 for the Time-Crunched Cyclist. The other kind of component is if your goals for the season are high intensity or incorporate high intensity efforts, criteriums, even some gravel racing, cross country mountain bike, etc., and you look at your zone distribution recently and you realize that it's almost entirely zone 2 because you've been really focusing in on what has been hyped up, it's time to start incorporating some intensity. The benefit is you have a giant, even if you've been doing it with only a few hours a week, you still have great aerobic development from it, especially if you have years behind you of aerobic development. But it's now time to leverage that aerobic development in order to get powered VO2, powered FTP, and that repeatability of anaerobic capacity.
Yeah, that's it. And I think, too, what we've talked about a little bit is contrast, right? Like having the contrast. I tell some of my athletes, like, man, life's lived in the contrast, right? Stress, rest, adaptation. Stress plus rest equals adaptation. And these contrasts, these yin and yangs that we kind of see pattern throughout life, it definitely prevails, in training. And if you always do what you've always done, you'll always have what you've always had, kind of thing.
If you only have 6 hours a week that you are training, you have a tremendous amount of time to recover.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the fact that you have so much of an advantage on the recovery side. Now, granted, we've always talked about lifestyle stress, and it's not all work training stress. But if you're only training 6 hours a week, you can get away with more intensity on the bike because you have so much more opportunity to recover off the bike. If you're training 20 hours a week, you can't ride intensely very often because you don't have the time to recover from it. So the reason that pro athletes are doing the majority of their work at easy intensities is because there's no other way that they couldn't possibly do more intensity and still recover from it. So the environment that a person is in as a time crunch cyclist and the opportunities that they have because of it are very different than somebody who is a high volume trainer. So it's, when a lot of the sports scientists and coaches that people are listening to tend to work with high volume athletes. They're patterning their advice off of what works for pros. And when you're working with folks who have very limited time, you can't always apply everything that worked with high volume to what worked with low volume.
Yeah. And I would say, depending on where everyone is getting their information, to make sure of that. Because if that physiologist that's working with the pro tour rider is popular, and you're just following that blindly, like, see where he's pulling that information from.
And that's not a slight on those individuals.
Not at all.
They're looking at their environment and they're very correct in terms of what's working for those athletes. It's just that I think that the time crunch athlete sometimes gets swept up into these things and doesn't recognize or fails to recognize the advantages that they do have as a time crunched athlete. You can do more, you have more flexibility with intensity in your training than somebody who is a high volume trainer.
Yeah. And again, like, and those people are right too. Like, there's no slight at it at all.
Right. And at the end of the day, we've, to me, especially with the whole rationale for writing Time-Crunched Cyclist and promoting it, the concept for all of these years has really been athlete identity. The idea that it really stinks to get dropped all the time, and it's no fun to get dropped all the time. And tailoring your training to take advantage of the fact that you have a low amount of time to devote to training, so that you can go out on the weekend and have fun with your friends, go and jump into a race and not get shot out the back. There are consequences to it. It means that you can't race maybe as frequently, or you're not going to perform as well in 6-hour road races or whatever. But the ability to keep people engaged and keep a time crunched cyclist having fun and in the community, I think outweighs the constraints that time crunch cycling puts on people's performance.
Fully agree with that. So if we only have like 6 hours straight up, and this goes right back to the original question, like, how do you get fast on 6 hours a week? I made these example workouts in a way that we target functional threshold power, or FTP, zone 4. The reason I made them to target on that is because if that is the most influential energy system to train, which is the glycolytic energy system. And without getting like superly confused here, if you got one thing to train in time crunched way, train functional threshold power. And I think of it in two ways: intensive and extensive. So if I'm in an intensive phase of training, I want to increase my FTP. So I'm going to train basically at the upper end of zone 4 to do that. And from the pattern standpoint that we talked about in the previous episode, we're really looking at like Tuesday and Thursday, 2 days a week, where we're really going to go hard on the intervals. And if we can, maybe another like Saturday. So let's talk about Tuesday, Thursday real quick. Tuesday, we're going to go 4 by 8 minutes at the upper end of threshold, which is about 95 to 105% of FTP. And I'm going to do about 4 to 5 minutes recovery in between, with a total ride time of 75 minutes. Wednesday can be totally off. Thursday, we're going to go 4 by 6 at the same upper end of FTP intensity, 4-minute recovery in between, total ride time 75 minutes. Saturday, okay, so then Friday was going to be off. Saturday, that can be your group ride or Zwift race or Zwift group ride, whatever. Sunday, do a couple hours at zone 2. That's 6 hours right there. Okay.
And that will make you faster.
That will make you faster. And those are pretty hard sessions, folks. Like we're talking 95 to 105% of your FTP. Keep that in mind. Okay. When we swing toward extensive threshold development, okay, we're going to use the same patterning of Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. And what we're going to do is just lengthen the intervals. So we're going to start on Tuesday with 2x20 at the lower end of threshold. So 91 to 91% of FTP, and take 5 to 7 minutes recovering between. And you can still get that done in about 75 minutes. You just have to not lollygag on the warm up and cool down. Okay.
Yeah, and this is actually one of the places where indoor cycling can be beneficial for folks, because
Totally.
you don't have to, especially for the 20-minute type intervals. People can often find an 8-minute space that they can do an interval outdoors.
Yep.
20-minute space without traffic lights and blah 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 is sometimes more difficult.
Challenging.
So I think one of the things we've definitely seen as an evolution of indoor cycling is people using their indoor setup to do focused interval work, and their outdoor areas to do more of the endurance or more of the either short intervals, like the 1 minute, 3 minute type intervals, or to do obviously group rides and things like that. But it's a really good integration is to use indoor cycling for that.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And especially when you're trying to condense 40 minutes worth of work in a 75-minute time slot, like that's hugely applicable.
Get on, warm up, do the intervals, and get on.
Yeah, exactly. And that's to this extensive threshold kind of program that we're talking about. 40 minutes of time in zone, 2x20, that's 40. Same thing with my Thursday workout, 3x12 minutes. That's 36, or pretty close to 40. Again, at that lower end of threshold, 91 to 101%, with 5 or 6 minutes recovery in between. The reason why I'm targeting like around 40 minutes of total time in zone and choosing intervals that are 10 minutes and longer is to influence or overload that glycolytic energy system at threshold power to give enough stimulus to get the adaptation at the end. Whereas on the intensive threshold development side of things, I'm choosing intervals that are less than 10 minutes, but at or slightly over threshold to get a stimulus that will increase your threshold. So again, like
now, would people do for these? Or is it that you do a couple weeks of the intensive work and then switch to extensive, or are you doing intensive 1 week, extensive the next? Like, how are you organizing these two training weeks within people's schedules?
Typically, if I want to make an improvement over time, I'm going to like just push into that energy system or push into that focus for around 3 weeks or so, 3 or 4 weeks. And I'd say with intensive threshold development, 3 weeks is pretty good. If it's extensive, I can usually drag that out to maybe 4 weeks or something like that. And then in what we're doing is just slotting in like an easier week, which can be for a time-crunched cyclist, could be like maybe one true recovery ride that week, and then the rest is just like kind of like easy zone 2. You don't have to do straight up recovery or just lay on the couch all week. That's not a recovery week, especially when you have 6 hours.
Right. Yeah, and I agree with that, not in the sense of you shouldn't ever take an entire week off or whatever else, but especially for time-crunched cyclists, it goes back to the lifestyle component. If you give up those time slots in your schedule, they go away and they're easily siphoned off to something else. So even on recovery weeks, I like for people to keep the schedule the same and ride very lightly or do something else, but don't give up that time, because time is going to get the honeydew list or whatever else is, a work component. There's always something else to do. So if that training time gets siphoned off, it's not coming back.
Yeah. And I think too, what I talked about is like, there's like the head, there's like the physical recovery, and then there's like the mental recovery. Right. And as you talked about, like the time crunched training athlete is time rich in recovery, just from we're sitting at a desk. It's you and me, right? And most of our listeners, right? We're sitting at a desk, not moving a ton throughout the day. Therefore, glycogen replenishment, hydration replenishment, all these things like recover actually pretty fast from a robotic mechanical standpoint. But blasting yourself with zone 4 3 days a week doing life and all this kind of stuff, mentally you can get a lot of fatigue rolling up in there. So the recovery
Yeah,
week, back to that, you get to ride your bike and not to have a performance aspect. You get to not go eyes bleeding and listen to your podcast or whatever it is, right?
exactly,
So like enjoy, and you're saying keep the schedule the same, but keep the frequency of training consistent is what we're talking about.
exactly.
Yeah, so I do think those workouts, they're really valuable for anybody who wants to, like, hey, how do I do this? Where do I start there? I think that'd be really beneficial. So I guess in summary, the first point is really stop with the zone 2 shaming, whether that's you shaming someone or yourself shaming yourself. But also what that means is like use a variety of training zones to help diversify your performance and your ability, because really if you're riding your bike outside, if you're doing events, you need all of those zones to develop yourself as a rider. Anything else that we talked about today, Ruddy, that you want to add to that?
Time-crunched cyclists have to be very cognizant of using every aspect of their physiology to their greatest benefit. And you have opportunities that other athletes do not have. Being a time-crunched athlete is not a disadvantage. It has its own caveats and it has its own characteristics, but it can be a very, rich and rewarding environment if you embrace it as opposed to lamenting it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good way of applying that, because I think so many of us, and myself included, it's just like, if you don't get a longer ride in for like 3 days in a row, you're like, oh, I'm working too much, or, whatever the case is. And so,
Well, it's an envy. I think people, you look at the guy that or the woman who does have their life in a different scenario than yours, and they're training 12 to 15 hours a
yeah,
week or whatever else, and you look longingly over at their schedule or their Instagram posts about all their rides and whatever else, and you get a little envious. And I think that rather than uh, continue down that road, the time crunch cyclist needs to embrace the fact that they have the hours that they have and make the best of those hours, and um, have use their training to have the most fun that they can.
yep. Yeah, that's it. And if you do it well by using like all this stuff that we talked about, including some of these example workouts, I think what you'll find, like when you time wise, you do open up or you jump in the group ride, like you start going faster, and all of a sudden everything's more fun because you're fit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep. Cool. Well, let's leave it there, Ruddy. Thanks again for joining us on the Time-Crunched Cyclist podcast. Looking forward to maybe one more with you down the road here.
absolutely.
All right. Thanks.